The cow was dying, and Garrett Hargrove knew it the way a man knows weather before it arrives. He did not need a doctor to tell him. He did not need the evidence of the shallow breath or the film clouding her eyes. He knew it in his hands, in the particular stillness of an animal that had stopped fighting whatever was pulling at it from below. He crouched in the frozen straw beside her, the lantern casting long amber shadows across the walls of the barn, and he placed one broad hand flat against her ribs. She was the third. In 2 weeks, the third. Each one had gone the same way. No fever, no labored coughing, no swelling in the joints that might point him towards some familiar trouble. Just a slow dimming, like a lamp running out of oil, until they lay down and did not get up again. He had sent for Dr. Crow twice already. Crow had come both times with his black bag and his careful voice, and his confident diagnosis billed Garrett $8 the first visit and $12 the second, and sold him medicine that had done nothing except lighten what little remained in the ranch's winter fund. $20 gone, 3 cows gone, and the rest of the herd standing at their feed troughs with a wariness in their eyes that Garrett did not like. Outside, the wind had shifted. He could hear it in the way the barn timbers groaned to a low complaint that meant the storm coming down from the northern mountains had finally stopped moving slow. By morning, it would be full upon them. He thought about the salt blocks along the south wall of the pasture, and he thought about the remaining herd, and he thought about the numbers he had written in his ledger that week, and none of the thinking led anywhere that felt like solid ground. He was still crouched there, hand resting on the dying cow's side, when he heard the sound of a horse entering the yard. Reed came through the barn door first, snow-dusting the shoulders of his coat, leading his mare by the reins. He was talking before he was fully inside, which was Reed's way, and the words were already shaped around something he expected to be difficult. "Garrett, before you say anything." Garrett did not look up from the cow. "I need you to hear me out. Then talk." There was a pause. The sound of the horse being tied to the post near the door. The sound of someone else behind Reed, lighter footsteps, slower, deliberate, in a way that suggested care rather than hesitation. Garrett turned his head. The woman was not what he expected. He was not sure what he had expected, but it was not this. She was small, her frame nearly lost inside a traveling coat that had long since gone damp with snow. Her hair, the color of honey, pressed flat against her temples where the cold had plastered it there. She held a lantern of her own, borrowed from somewhere, and she moved through the barn door with the controlled steadiness of a person concentrating hard on not showing how cold they were. Beside her, draped against Reed's arm and deeply asleep, was a child, a small boy with pale hair and pale hands clutching a carved wooden horse to his chest. Garrett stood. Reed opened his mouth to explain. The woman spoke first. "How long has this one been down?" Her eyes were on the cow, not on Garrett, not on the barn around her, not on the 2 brothers standing there watching her. She was looking at the animal on the floor with an attention that was professional in its focus. 2 days, Garrett said. She handed her lantern to Reed without looking at him, moved past Garrett, and crouched beside the cow in the same position he had just vacated. Her hands, he noticed, were the hands of someone who worked, chapped at the knuckles, strong at the wrist, unhesitating as they moved through an examination that followed a logic he recognized. Eyes first, mouth, the line of the jaw, the front legs, the belly. She worked quietly and without explanation, and Garrett watched her and said nothing. "The 2 before this one," she said, not looking up, "did they go the same way, identical? Where did they spend most of their time in the barn?" Garrett studied her profile in the lantern light. "Near the salt blocks, south end of the pasture." She stopped. Her hands went still against the cow's flank. Then she rose to her feet and looked at him directly for the first time, and the color of her eyes in the lamplight was something he would not find words for until much later. Clear and deeply blue, the kind of blue that does not ask for anything from you. "Could you show me the south blocks," she said, "before we go inside?" Garrett looked at the snow blowing past the open barn door, looked at her damp coat and reddened hands, looked at the sleeping child still draped over his brother's arm. "Now," she added, and it was not a demand. It was simply a statement of priority, and priority was a language he understood. He picked up the lantern and walked toward the door. She followed without another word. They stood together in the snow beside the salt blocks along the south fence line while the wind came off the mountain in long, cold sheets. Garrett held the lantern close to the nearest block, and the woman crouched down and looked at it the way she had looked at the cow, studied its surface, ran one finger along the edge, and brought that finger close to her face in the lantern light. She did not taste it. She simply looked, and something moved behind her eyes that he could not read. "How long have these blocks been here?" she asked. "Since early October. Same as every year." She nodded slowly. Then she stood, tucked her hands under her arms against the cold, and looked at him. "My name is Clara Whitfield," she said. "I wrote you a letter 6 weeks ago, or I wrote someone at this ranch a letter. I was told the advertisement belonged to the Hargrove family." Garrett said nothing for a moment. Snow gathered on the brim of his hat. "I know," he said finally. "Reed showed me the letter when it arrived." "Then you know I'm not supposed to be a surprise. You're not supposed to have a child with you, either." The wind pushed between them. "No," she agreed, "I'm not. And I'll explain that, but not out here." He looked at her one more time in the wavering lantern light. This woman who had arrived in a blizzard, who had spoken to a dying cow before she had spoken her own name, who stood in 6 inches of snow without flinching, and offered explanation as a matter of fairness, rather than apology. "Come inside," he said. He did not wait to see if she followed. He already knew she would. Inside the main cabin, Owen was up. He had heard the horses, and he was standing near the fireplace with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the particular expression that meant he had already formed an opinion and was waiting for someone to give him a reason to revise it. He was the youngest of the three brothers and the most direct, which often looked like coldness to people who did not know him and occasionally looked like coldness to people who did. He looked at Clara. He looked at the child now transferred gently to the braided rug near the hearth. He looked at Reed. "The letter didn't say anything about a child," Owen said. "No," Reed said. "You knew when you got the response that there was a child?" "No, I found out tonight." Owen looked at Clara again. She was kneeling beside the boy, working his small boots off with practiced efficiency, checking his fingers and his toes with that same quiet professionalism she had brought to the cow. She did not appear to be listening to the conversation, but Garrett could tell she was. "What else didn't the letter mention?" Owen asked. Clara answered without looking up. "Quite a lot, I know that, and I'll tell you all of it, but not tonight and not while Jasper is still wet and cold." She peeled a damp sock from the boy's foot and examined his toes, pressing each one gently. "He's borderline. He needs warmth and he needs sleep in that order." Owen's jaw tightened. "You're making decisions in a house you've been inside for 4 minutes. I'm making medical observations." She looked up at him then, and there was nothing apologetic in it. "You can be angry about that in the morning. Tonight I need a blanket and a dry place to put him." The room was quiet except for the fire and the wind against the windows. Garrett went to the chest near his bedroom door and came back with a wool blanket. He handed it to her without comment. She wrapped the boy without hesitation, tucking the edges under him with the efficiency of someone who had done it many times before. The child stirred, murmured something, and settled back into sleep with the wooden horse still clutched to his chest. Reed put water on for tea. Owen sat down in the chair by the far wall and did not say anything else that night, which in its own way was a kind of acceptance, or at least the beginning of one. Clara sat on the floor beside the boy and accepted the tea when Reed brought it and drank it without speaking. The fire worked at the cold in her coat, and gradually the tension in her shoulders eased degree by degree, like ice going soft at the edges. Garrett pulled a chair close to the hearth and sat. He watched the fire for a while. Then he said, "We'll talk in the morning." She looked at him. "All right, but we will talk." "Yes," she said, "we will." That was the first night. In the morning she was up before any of them. Garrett came out of his room before 4 and found the kitchen already lit, the stove already fed a pan of oats, already set to warm on the back burner. Clara was standing at the window looking out at the dark, her hands wrapped around a cup of her own. She turned when she heard him and did not seem startled. "Biscuits or oats?" she said. He looked at her, looked at the stove. "Oats. They'll be ready when you come back from the barn." He picked up his hat and his coat, stopped at the door. "The grist's in the bin marked with the red lid. Salt's on the second shelf." "I found it." He went out into the cold. It was the beginning of something neither of them named for a long time, but it had the shape of a partnership, or at least the skeleton of one. Each morning she was in the kitchen before him. Each morning he told her one thing she needed to know about the ranch, practical and brief, and she received it without elaboration. There were no discussions of terms, no conversations about what this arrangement was or was not. They simply moved through the same space with a care for each other's work that took the form of small concessions. Owen, true to his nature, tested her on the second day. He found her in the kitchen at mid-morning and asked without preamble what she could do besides cook. His voice was not unkind. It was the voice of a man who needed information. She told him. She was a midwife and a general practitioner of the practical variety, trained by a physician who believed that useful knowledge did not belong exclusively to people with university degrees. She could assist in difficult births, human or animal. She could identify and treat common infections, set minor fractures, close wounds that needed closing. She understood basic pharmacology because she had been taught which compounds helped and which ones harmed, and why the difference mattered. If he had a sick horse, she said she would know where to start. Owen was quiet for a moment. That's what you told yourself in the letter. I told you in the letter that I was skilled at medical care and hard work. I didn't tell you the details. You also didn't tell us about the boy. She met his eyes. No, I didn't. Why? She thought about the answer, not performing thought, but actually arriving at it. Because I needed to get here first, she said. If I had mentioned Jasper in the letter, the offer might have been withdrawn, and Jasper needed to get here. Owen studied her for a long moment. That's an honest answer. It's the only kind I have. He walked out without another word, but that evening, without being asked, he carried a second armload of wood into the cabin and stacked it near the fireplace where she could reach it easily. Garrett noticed. He said nothing about it. He filed it away in the part of his mind where he kept the things that mattered. Reed was the easiest, which surprised no one. He had always been the one who looked for the thing worth keeping in a situation before cataloging what was wrong with it. He sat on the kitchen floor with Jasper on the second evening and asked the boy the name of the wooden horse. Jasper looked at him with gray eyes that were older than 6 years should have been. He doesn't have one. Reed nodded the way a man nods when he receives a piece of information that requires real consideration. We'll have to think on that. Jasper went back to his horse. Reed went back to his coffee. And something in the way the boy's small shoulders settled, the way they dropped half an inch from where they'd been carrying themselves, told Garrett something about what that child had been holding before he walked through their door. By the end of the first week, the cabin had changed, not dramatically, not in any way that a stranger would have named on first entry, but Garrett felt it in the way you feel a shift in pressure before rain, a slow adjustment of atmosphere. There was a bowl of dried sage and juniper on the kitchen shelf that had not been there before. The pile of mending that had lived in the corner of the main room for most of a year had quietly disappeared. The floors, which he swept when he remembered to, had taken on a different quality of clean. He caught himself noticing it. He did not like catching himself noticing it, which told him something he was not prepared to examine directly. On the fourth morning, she slipped on the ice between the cabin door and the water trough. He was 3 steps ahead of her and turned at the sound of her foot going out, and he put his hand out without thinking. She caught his forearm and righted herself, and they stood for one suspended second in the gray morning light, her grip on his wrist, his hand near her elbow, close enough that he could see the faint line of her breath in the cold air. Then she let go. Thank you, she said. Watch the step, he said. He walked on. She walked on. But he was aware for the rest of that morning of the exact spot on his forearm where her hand had been. On the 9th day, he found 3 more cows down. He stood in the barn in the early morning dark and counted what he had left, and the numbers were bad. Reed came in behind him and made the same count and arrived at the same place. 17 head remaining, and 3 of those already showing the slow drift in their gait that meant something was pulling at them. I'm sending for Crow again, Reed said. Garrett said nothing. We don't have another option right now. I know. Garrett looked at the south end of the barn, looked at the salt blocks. He kept coming back to the salt blocks, and he could not explain why, except that Clara had looked at them with something particular in her face, and he had learned in the past 9 days that when Clara looked at something with that expression, there was a reason. He found her in the kitchen an hour later and said without introduction, "The blocks, south end. You looked at them the first night like something was wrong." She was at the table sorting through the contents of her medical bag, the kind of sorting that was more about having something to do with her hands than actual necessity. She looked up. I looked at them because The cows that went down first were the ones nearest to them, she said carefully. That could mean nothing. It could mean poor positioning in the barn, or it could mean something else. What else? She held his gaze for a moment. The symptoms I've seen are not consistent with respiratory illness. No fever progression, no nasal inflammation, no coughing as a primary symptom. They go to the eyes first, then the gait, then they go down. She paused. That pattern is more consistent with systemic poisoning than with infection. The word landed in the room like a stone in still water. Poisoning, Garrett said. I could be wrong. I probably am wrong. I don't have the tools to confirm it without sending a sample to someone who can do a proper chemical analysis. You want a sample of the salt? I want a sample of the salt. He looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had arrived 9 days ago in a blizzard with a borrowed lantern and a sleeping child and had spoken her first words to a dying cow. This woman who said she could be wrong and meant it. Take the sample, he said. She nodded and reached for her bag. When Dr. Crow arrived that afternoon, he came with the same unhurried competence he always brought. He was a neat man, Silas Crow, the kind of neat that spoke of deliberate care. His silver hair was always combed. His coat was always brushed. He carried himself with a particular ease of someone who had been the most educated person in every room he had entered for 20 years and who had made his peace with that fact. He examined the 3 new cases with thoroughness and patience. He asked Garrett sensible questions about feed and water. He spoke with the 2 brothers who were present with the measured warmth of a man who knew these people and cared for them, which, in the way that some things can be both true and incomplete, was not entirely false. When Clara appeared in the barn doorway, Crow turned and smiled with what appeared to be genuine pleasure. This must be the new Mrs. Hargrove, or almost Mrs. Hargrove. He removed his hat. Silas Crow, I've been the family physician here since Garrett first broke ground. Welcome to Montana territory. Clara shook his hand. Clara Whitfield, I understand you've been treating the herd. Trying to, he said with a rueful tilt of his head. Mountain winters can be brutal on livestock. What we're seeing is a respiratory complication that sometimes runs through herds when the temperature shifts too fast. The animal systems can't adjust quickly enough. He looked at her with the polite attention of a man who has said this before and is prepared to explain it patiently. Are you familiar with cattle medicine at all? Somewhat, she said. Then you'll understand that this kind of secondary inflammation is not uncommon. I've prescribed a course of treatment that should stabilize the worst cases. He looked at Garrett. The ones that are already down are going to be difficult. I want to be honest with you about that, but the healthy animals can be protected if we stay ahead of it. He sold them another course of medicine. He was kind about the price, which was $12, and Garrett paid it because he did not know what else to do. When Crow was preparing to leave, he paused near the barn door and turned. Something in his expression shifted slightly, not dramatically, just a flicker of something that adjusted his face and was then gone. One thing, and he said, I understand you've been looking at the mineral blocks out along the south fence. If you have any concerns about the quality of the salt, I'd be glad to take a sample into town and check it for you. I have some basic analytical equipment in my office. Garrett watched him. Just an offer, Crow said. It's probably nothing, but I want to be thorough. We appreciate that, Reed said. Crow nodded and went out into the cold, and his horse carried him back toward Millhaven with the patient rhythm of an animal that knew the road. After he was gone, Clara stood near the barn door, looking at the ground where his horse's hooves had left clean prints in the fresh snow. She stood there for a moment longer than the moment called for. Then she went back inside. None of them talked about it. But Garrett noticed. That night was the 9th night, and it was the night Owen could not sleep. Garrett was aware of this because Garrett himself could not sleep, which was nothing new, and he lay in the dark listening to the sounds of the cabin and heard the soft scrape of a chair being pulled across the kitchen floor and the particular quality of quiet that meant someone was sitting at the table trying to work something out. He almost went to the door, but the quality of the quiet said it was something private and he left it alone. In the morning, Reed told him, Owen was up half the night with the ledger. Garrett poured his coffee. He's been trying to read the accounts, Reed said. Been trying for a while, I think. He just doesn't know the system. Garrett looked at the kitchen table empty, now the ledger back on its shelf where it lived. He thought about Owen, who had grown up in the shadow of 2 older brothers who compensated for whatever it was he thought he lacked by being the first one to say the hard thing, the first one to ask the question that needed asking. Garrett knew that Shadow better than Owen would ever believe. He didn't ask you to help him, Garrett said. He wouldn't ask me. He'd sooner sit up half the night. Later that day, Garrett passed the kitchen and saw Clara sitting across the table from Owen, the ledger open between them. Owen was looking at a column of numbers with the expression of a man concentrating past the edge of his comfort. Clara was pointing at something with a pencil, talking in a low, even voice, and Owen was listening in the way he listened when he had decided to actually hear something which was different from the way he usually listened to people. Garrett did not slow his pace. He did not make it known that he had seen. But something in his chest shifted in a way he could not account for and would not examine, not yet. Not tonight. The evening of the 14th day, Reed sat at the kitchen table after supper while Clara washed the dishes and Owen had gone outside to check the horses. The fire was low and comfortable, and the cabin held the particular warmth of a place that had recently been fed. "Can I tell you something?" Reed said. Clara turned from the basin. "Yes." He looked at his hands on the table. Reed, who was never at a loss for words, took a moment to find the right arrangement of them. "The advertisement. The reason I placed it. You don't have to explain it to me. I know, but I want to." He looked up. Part of it was Garrett, 2 years of watching him move through this place like he's already somewhere else. Like most of him went when Margaret went, and the part that stayed behind is just keeping the herd fed. He turned his coffee cup in a circle on the table. But part of it was something else. I had a reason of my own. Clara dried her hands on the kitchen cloth and sat down across from him. "There was a woman," Reed said, "back in Maryland before we came out here. I was 22 and I thought I knew what I was doing, and I left because Garrett needed help with the land, and I told myself she'd understand and she'd wait." He stopped. "She didn't wait. She didn't owe me waiting. I just didn't understand that at the time." The fire settled. "I placed the advertisement because I needed to believe that someone could come to a strange place and start something new from nothing. That you could arrive without history and build something real." He looked at her directly. "I needed to see if that was actually possible." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Is it," she said, "possible?" Reed almost smiled. "Ask me again in the spring." She studied him. "You're a good man, Reed Hargrove." "I'm a twant who makes decisions and then has to live inside them," he said. "Same as everyone." She nodded. "Then what was her name? Abigail. Was she worth leaving?" Reed thought about it honestly. "She was worth staying for. That's the difference. I never understood it until I'd already gone." They sat in the kitchen quiet for a while after that, and it was not an uncomfortable quiet. It was the quiet of two people who had told each other something real and found that the room was still standing. On the 15th night, Clara stood at the kitchen window after the house had gone still. She was not looking at anything in particular. She was holding the letter she had not sent, the one she wrote on the train coming west, the one addressed to a man 3 years in the ground who had given her his name and his knowledge, and the only version of a home she had ever known. She held it without opening it. Some nights she simply needed to hold it. The moon was full, and Montana was flat white under it, the snow covering everything in the same mute perfection that made the world look simpler than it was. She almost went to bed. But something made her look toward the tree line, the dark border of pines half a mile north of the cabin, and what she saw there stopped her. A light, small and low and not moving. The kind of light a fire makes when it has been burning a while and settled into its own rhythm. A camp light. Someone was camped at the edge of the Hargrove land and had been there long enough for the snow around the camp to show disturbance in the moonlight. She stood very still. The light was not new. Looking at the pattern of the snow, the way the disturbed ground spread in a particular radius, she understood it had been there for more than one night. Perhaps 3, perhaps more. She did not wake Garrett, not yet. She needed to think first, and she had learned over the past 2 weeks that her thinking was more useful when she did not speak it before it was finished. She moved through the main room, quietly opened the door to the small room where Jasper slept, and crossed to the bed. The boy was deeply under the wooden horse on the blanket beside his hand. She lifted him gently, just enough to shift his position so that when she tucked the blanket around him again, he was closer to the interior wall and further from the window. He did not wake. She stood over him for a moment in the dark. Outside, the camp light was still burning at the edge of the trees. Patient, waiting. She went back to the kitchen and sat down at the table with her unread letter and her cold cup of tea and the particular alertness of someone who has been running long enough to know what it feels like when the distance behind you has shortened. She had told them most of the truth. She had told them about Jasper, about the papers, about the night she walked out of Whitmore House with a 6-year-old boy and the evidence of what Ezra Mulgrew had been doing in the dark. She had told them there was a man named Harlan Voss who worked for Mulgrew and who would come looking. What she had not told them was the shape of the second signature on Jasper's adoption papers. The one she had read a dozen times on the train and could not fully decipher 4 initials pressed into a line with the authority of someone who signed documents the way other men breathed. She had not told them because she did not know yet what it meant. She did not know yet whose name those letters spelled. She was still working on it. The fire in the hearth burned low. The camp light at the tree line held steady. Somewhere in the barn, one of the Hargrove horses moved in its stall, a sound like the night breathing. Clara folded the unsent letter and put it back in her coat pocket where it lived, and she sat in the kitchen of a house that was not yet hers and watched the window until the cold outside turned the camp light indistinguishable from the stars, and then she went to bed. She did not sleep deeply. She never did when the distance felt short, but she slept. And in the morning breakfast was on the table before Garrett came through the kitchen door, and the day began the way the days had begun to begin, with the particular rhythm of a household that was still learning its own shape, still negotiating the distances between people who did not yet know how close they were willing to stand. Garrett came through the door and stopped. Clara was at the stove. She had not heard him come in, or if she had not turned. And in that unguarded moment, with her back to the room and her attention on whatever was in the pan, she looked like someone who had been standing in that kitchen for years. Not because she fit the kitchen, not because the kitchen fit her, but because of something harder to name. A quality of being present in a place, of being for the moment nowhere else. He stood in the doorway and felt something that he did not have a word for and was not going to look for. Not today. He took off his hat and sat down at the table and said nothing. She turned with 2 plates and set them on the table and sat across from him, and they ate the way they had begun to eat, in a quiet that was neither empty nor full, but something in between, a shared silence with the particular weight of 2 people who are learning whether the quiet between them is safe. Outside, the mountains held the snow they had been holding all month, white and old and permanent. The cattle moved in the pasture, what was left of them, their breath rising in small clouds against the winter air. The pines at the north tree line stood as they always stood, dark and straight and giving nothing away. And somewhere beneath the frozen surface of a salt block along the south fence, something was working its slow, patient damage on the animals that came to it in the ordinary course of a winter day. None of them knew yet. Not Garrett, not Reed, not Owen. But Clara knew enough to be afraid, and being afraid for Clara Whitfield had never yet been a reason to stop. The morning Reed left for Denver, 6 more cows were down. Garrett stood in the center of the barn and counted them with the same deliberate calm he applied to everything that threatened to break him. 6 animals lying in the straw at angles that said they had not chosen to lie down, but had arrived there because their bodies had finally stopped arguing with whatever was working against them. 3 of them were from the south end of the pasture. The other 3 had been fine as recently as yesterday. He did not swear. He did not kick the fence post or drive his fist into the barn wall the way Owen had done when the numbers got bad enough. He simply stood in the cold and counted and let the numbers settle into him the way a man lets bad news settle, not quickly, not without resistance, but with the understanding that resistance eventually has to stop. Reed came up behind him, made his own count, arrived at the same conclusion. "You want me to go today?" Reed said. "Today. The chemist in Denver, if he can do it quickly, we're looking at 9 days before I'm back with anything useful." "Then you'd better ride fast." Reed went. He took the sample Clara had prepared, wrapped in a square of clean linen and sealed inside a tin, and he took the description she had written in her careful hand of the symptoms she had observed, the timeline, the pattern. He took a letter from Garrett to a man he had done business with twice before, a man who knew a chemist, and he rode south toward the rail connection that would carry him the rest of the way. The ranch felt his absence before noon. Clara noticed it first, or at least she was the first to name it. She said nothing aloud. But at midday, she brought a second tin of coffee out to Garrett, where he was working on the fence line, and set it on the post beside him without being asked, and the act of it, the simple accounting for the fact that he was working alone now, where two had been working before, told him she was paying attention to the things that did not announce themselves. He looked at the coffee, looked at her. "Thank you," he said. She walked back toward the cabin. He watched her go, and then he went back to the fence. That evening, Owen came in from town with a look on his face that Garrett had learned over 25 years to read as the look of a man carrying something he is not sure how to put down. He sat at the kitchen table. He looked at his hands. He said, "There's a man at the boarding house in Mill Haven. Been there at least 10 days, maybe longer. Asked Mrs. Dunmore his first morning about whether any family in the area had recently taken on new help, whether anyone had a woman and a child newly arrived." Clara, standing at the stove, did not turn around, but the movement of her hands stopped for one precise moment and then resumed. "What did he look like?" she said. Owen described him. Thin, tall hair, cut close to the kind of stillness about him that does not come from peace or shame. "Harlan Voss," she said. "That name means something specific." She turned from the stove then. She looked at Owen and then at Garrett, and she made a decision in the space between one breath and the next. "Sit down," she said, "both of you." She told them everything. Not the version she had told before, the careful edited version that contained the important facts but kept their jagged edges smooth. This time she told them the full shape of it. Ezra Mulgrew in the Meridian Labor Company, and the papers she had found in the gap between the medicine cabinet and the wall. The contracts, with their careful language and their deliberate obscurity, designed to look like adoption documents to anyone who did not know how to read the space between the words. The night she had lifted Jasper from his bed and walked out of Whitmore House with nothing but a bag of medical supplies and the evidence she had taken from the office floor, she told them about the signature she could not read, the second one on Jasper's contract below Mulgrew's. Four initials written in a hand she had tried to decipher on the train and on the slow days of the first week at the ranch, and in the quiet hours when the house was asleep and she sat at the table with the document flat in the lamplight. She could read the first letter, S. She could read the last letter, C. The middle two were compressed and crossed in a way that resisted her. She told them that she had used their advertisement at an exit, that she had written the letter on the road with nothing in her pocket but $14 and the certainty that wherever she was going had to be safer than where she had been, that she had not mentioned Jasper because she could not afford for the offer to be withdrawn before she could get the boys somewhere that was not St. Louis. She looked at Garrett when she said that last part. Not with apology exactly, but with the directness of someone who is choosing honesty over comfort. The kitchen was quiet for a long time. Owen said, "You've known Voss was in the area how long?" "I saw a camp light at the tree line 12 nights ago. I've been watching it since." "Well, you didn't tell us." "No, Hadal." "Why?" She thought about the answer honestly. "Because I wasn't sure enough, and because I was afraid of what it would mean for us if I was right." Owen's jaw tightened. That word "us" had landed somewhere it had not been invited, and he was not ready to decide what to do with it. He stood up and went to the window and looked out at the dark. Garrett had not moved. He sat at the table with his hands flat on the wood and looked at Clara across from him, and there was something working in his face that she could not entirely read, something that was not anger and was not absolution either, but was the particular expression of a man who is deciding something important and will not be hurried. "The man who sent Voss," he said finally, "does he know where you are specifically?" "He knows the name of the town. The advertisement listed the post office." "Then we assume he knows the ranch." "Yes." Garrett looked at Owen's back at the window. "We keep a watch at night. Starting tonight, you and I alternate. 3-hour intervals." He looked back at Clara. "You and Jasper stay in the cabin after dark. No exceptions." "Garrett," she said, "no exceptions." She held his gaze. Then slowly she nodded. It was not agreement exactly. It was acknowledgement, which he accepted because he knew the difference. Martha Hensley arrived 2 mornings later. She came on horseback, which was unusual enough at this distance to bring Garrett out of the barn before she had finished tying her horse to the post. Martha Hensley was the wife of Frank Hensley, who ran the general goods store on Millhaven's main street, and she was one of those women the Western Territory seemed to produce in particular abundance. Practical, warm, deeply intelligent in the way that long years of solving real problems makes a person intelligent. She did not make unnecessary trips. The fact that she was here before 8 in the morning, still catching her breath from a hard ride, told Garrett the trip had been necessary. "I need to speak to the young woman," she said without greeting. He brought her inside. Clara was at the table with Jasper, who was eating oats and watching a spider make its way across the windowsill with the focused attention of someone who finds the world reliably interesting. Martha sat down across from Clara and leaned forward, elbows on the table, in the manner of a woman who has decided that brevity is more important than form. "I was restocking the side room at the boarding house yesterday morning," she said. "The walls there are thin as paper. I didn't set out to hear what I heard, but I heard it." She paused. The man in room 3 was talking to someone. Not loudly, but the voice carried. He said the name Silver Fork Ranch. He said the woman and the boy. He said by the end of the week. Clara was very still. "I don't know who he was talking to," Martha said. "He might have been alone talking to himself, working something through, or there might have been someone with him." She looked at Clara steadily. "But you needed to know." Clara looked at the table, looked at Jasper, who had abandoned the spider in favor of moving his oats around his bowl in a pattern of some personal significance. Then she looked at Martha Hensley and said, "Thank you for coming." Martha nodded. She stood. She looked around this cabin with an appraising eye, the kind of eye that takes in a space and understands what it has been and what it is becoming. Then she looked at Garrett, where he stood near the door. "You've got good people here," she said to him, which was all she said, and then she went back out to her horse and rode toward Millhaven. Garrett closed the door, turned to the room. Owen had come in from the barn when he heard the horse and was standing against the near wall. No one spoke for a moment. Then Jasper said without looking up from his oats, "Is someone coming here that we don't want?" Clara looked at the boy. She had been watching him closely for 2 weeks now. The particular way he absorbed information without appearing to the manner in which he filed things away and then produced them at unexpected moments with a matter-of-factness that was either entirely innocent or deeply wise, and she had not yet determined which. "We're taking care of it," she said. Jasper considered this, moved a portion of his oats to a different area of the bowl. "Owen looks like he's taking care of it," he said. "That's how Owen looks when he's doing something." Owen, who had not moved from the wall, looked at the boy with an expression that was almost surprised. Then he looked at the window. "Finish your breakfast," he said. Jasper finished his breakfast. The next 3 nights, Garrett and Owen kept their watch. Clara knew this because she heard them. The sound of the door opening and closing at the interval changes the muffled sound of boots on frozen ground. She lay awake and listened and counted the sounds and found in their regularity something that was not quite the same as safety, but was adjacent to it. On the 3rd of those nights, Garrett came back in at 2 in the morning and found her sitting at the kitchen table with the accounts ledger open. He stopped in the doorway. She looked up. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "I found a discrepancy in the October figures." He came in and hung his coat on the hook, sat down across from her, looked at the column she was pointing to. "The feed invoice for the 2nd week," she said. "You've recorded $40, but the receipt stub shows 32. It's a small difference, but if it's repeated across months, it compounds." He looked at the numbers. She was right. He had been careless about it, and she had found it in 2 hours with a lamp and a pencil. "Where did you learn accounts?" he said. "Same place I learned everything. Dr. Whitfield. He said that a person who doesn't understand money in and money out will never understand why their decisions keep going wrong." He looked at the ledger, looked at her hands on the pages. "He sounds like a man who said a lot of things." "He did. Most of them were right." She paused. "He was the only person who ever thought there was something in me worth teaching. That stays with a person." The fire ticked in the hearth. Garrett looked at the open ledger, the columns of numbers that told the story of 5 years of work in the dry language of addition and subtraction, and he thought about the years those numbers represented, the seasons of good and bad. The winter after Thomas died, when the numbers had nearly reached 0, and he had kept going because there was nothing else to do. The first year Margaret had been here, when the numbers had begun to look different because someone else was watching them with him. He thought about Margaret. He had been thinking about her less these past 2 weeks, as in the particular sharp way he had been thinking about her since the morning he had come in from the barn and found her on the floor. He was not sure what to do with the fact of that lessening. It felt like a thing that could be either betrayal or healing, depending on who was counting. She sat at this table, he said, without planning to say it. Clara looked up at him. Margaret, she kept the accounts. She was better at them than I was. He looked at the grain of the wood. She said the same thing Whitfield said, more or less. Clara was quiet. She did not rush to fill the space. She would have been reading you, he said, from the first night. She had a way of doing that, of watching a person until she understood what they needed and then finding a way to give it to them without making a production of it. He paused. She would have decided about you very quickly, and she would have been right. What do you think she would have decided? He considered it honestly, the way he did all things that mattered. That you were someone who had been carrying more than your share for a long time, and that you were stronger for it than you knew, and that you needed someone to stop asking you to prove that and just let you be it. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the cold pressed against the windows, and the mountains stood in the dark doing what mountains do, which is nothing, which is everything. Clara looked at the table. When she looked up, something in her face had changed. Something that had been held carefully in place had eased, not entirely, but enough to show its shape. She sounds like someone worth knowing, she said. She was. They sat with that for a moment. Then Garrett pulled the ledger toward him and looked at the October figures and said, "Show me where else you found the discrepancy." And they worked through the accounts together until 3 in the morning, sitting across from each other in the lamplight, with the arithmetic of a life between them. It was 11 days after Reed had gone that the second storm came. It arrived the way Montana storms arrive, when they mean it, without the slow advance that gives you time to prepare. 1 hour, the sky was simply overcast, pressing low and gray, and then the temperature dropped 15 degrees in 40 minutes, and the wind turned, and by nightfall, the snow was coming horizontal off the northern range with a sound like something being torn. Garrett had moved the worst of the sick animals into the interior of the barn that afternoon, a precaution against the cold accelerating whatever was already happening to them. Owen had checked the south fence twice and reported the gate latches solid. They had done what could be done. Clara put Jasper to bed early, telling him the storm would be loud and not to be afraid of it. He told her he was not afraid of it, with the particular seriousness of a 6-year-old who has decided that fear is a category of experience that doesn't apply to him, which she found both moving and exhausting. She tucked him in against the interior wall and kissed his forehead and went back to the main room. They all went to sleep eventually because there was nothing else to do. At 2 in the morning, Clara came awake to a sound beneath the storm. Not the storm itself. Something inside the storm, a quality of agitation from the direction of the barn, the sound animals make when something has disturbed them, that is not weather. She was out of her blanket and across the room before she had finished understanding what she had heard. She opened Garrett's door. He was already awake, already pulling on his boots. She opened Owen's door. He was sitting up. They went out into the blizzard together. The south gate of the cattle pasture was standing open, not blown open. The latch was a heavy iron bar that required deliberate lifting. It was standing open because someone had lifted the latch and pushed the gate and walked away, and the cattle nearest to it had smelled the open air or heard something in the dark and had gone through, because cattle will when they are frightened and there is a way out. What followed was an hour that Garrett would not fully remember afterward, only in pieces. The lanterns fighting the wind. Clara at the east corner of the pasture doing what he told her to do, standing her ground against the driving snow and turning the panicking animals back toward the gate with her voice and the light, in a determination that he had time to notice even in the middle of everything else. Owen on horseback in the north field, barely visible through the whiteout. The sound of animals that were too sick to move well slipping in the new snow going down. By the time they got the gate closed and the surviving cattle back inside the barn and stood in the wreckage of what the night had been, the lanterns showed them 11 animals dead or dying in the snow. 11. Garrett stood in the doorway of the barn and looked at them. He did not move for a long time. Owen came up beside him. Owen, who said the hard thing when it needed saying, said nothing. Clara stood a few steps back. Her coat was white with packed snow, her face raw from the wind. Jasper had appeared in the cabin doorway behind them, woken by the noise and drawn to the light, and when he saw the shapes in the snow, he had come across the yard and taken Clara's hand without being asked. She had let him. She stood holding the boy's hand and looking at Garrett's back, and she did not try to say anything, because there was nothing to say that the night had not already said better. The morning that came after that night was the gray kind, the kind with no warmth in it, the light as flat and unforgiving as a ledger page. Garrett was out in the barn before anyone else doing the accounting of what remained. 16 animals, 4 of them already compromised. In the best case, 12 healthy animals going into the deep of winter. In the worst case, fewer. Reed came back on the 9th day after the storm. He arrived in the afternoon with snow on his shoulders and a tin canister under his arm, and an expression that Garrett read before Reed had opened his mouth. The expression of a man who has found out something true and is deciding how to say it. He set the canister and a sealed letter on the kitchen table. The letter was from the chemist in Denver, written in formal language that left no room for misinterpretation. Clara read it first, standing at the table with Owen on one side and Garrett on the other. Sodium arsenate. 3 pounds mixed into the mineral substrate of the salt blocks. Not at a concentration that would kill quickly, which would have been obvious and traceable. At a concentration that would kill slowly over weeks, accumulating in the systems of animals that return to the blocks day after day, as animals do, because they need the minerals and do not know the difference. This was not a disease. It was not a failure of management or a run of bad luck or the indifferent cruelty of a Montana winter. Someone had put arsenic in the salt blocks on the south fence of Silver Fork Ranch, and 17 animals were dead because of it. The room was very quiet. Owen was the one who said what all of them were thinking. He said it flatly, without theater, in the manner of a man who prefers to put a thing into the air where it can be examined. Crow offered to test the salt himself, first time he came out after Clara said she wanted a sample. The silence that followed was a different quality from the one before. Garrett looked at the report in Clara's hands, looked at the kitchen wall, looked at nothing in particular. Reed said, "We need more than suspicion." "I know," Garrett said. "The chemist's report confirms what was in the salt. It doesn't confirm who put it there." "I know." Clara set the report on the table. She sat down and did not speak for a moment. Then she reached into the medical bag that lived at the end of the table and began moving its contents around in the particular way she did when she was thinking through something she was not ready to say. Then she said it. "When I first arrived, Jasper had papers in his bag. The adoption contract from Whitmore House. There are 2 signatures on it." She kept her eyes on the bag. "I've been trying to read the second one for weeks. The initials are compressed and partially crossed. I've been able to read the first letter and the last letter, S and C." She stopped. There was a title beneath the signature. 2 words. The second word is a place name. I've been trying to read the first word for 3 weeks, and I have not been able to get it. She looked up. "Today I can read it." The room waited. "Medical witness," she said. "It says medical witness Millhaven." No one spoke. S blank blank C, Owen said slowly. Millhaven. He stopped. The thing that was assembling itself in the room was not a small thing, and they all understood that once it was assembled, it could not be taken apart. "Silas Archibald Crow," Clara said. "I don't know his middle name, but if his initials are SAC and his title is medical witness in this jurisdiction." She stopped. She looked at Garrett. "Then he signed those papers. He witnessed the sale of a child and signed his name to it." Garrett sat down. The table held them all. Outside the cabin, the early dark of a Montana November was coming down from the mountains the way it always did, indifferent and absolute. The fire in the hearth was doing its quiet work. Jasper was in the back room with his wooden horse, making the small sounds of a child engaged in a private project. For a moment, no one was anything except people sitting in a room with knowledge they could not unfind. Then Reed said, "If it's him, if it's really him, we need to be certain before we walk into town and say what we're thinking. A doctor's reputation in a place this size is not nothing. We need the sober book. We need to see the sales record." "You're talking about walking into his office," Owen said. "I'm talking about someone walking into his office." Owen looked at Clara. She was already looking at the table with the expression she wore when she was working through logistics. "His sales ledger is on the shelf behind his examination table," she said. "I've seen it both times I've been in the office. It's a standard pharmaceutical record. He keeps it open on the shelf because there's no reason to hide a record that you don't expect anyone to question." She looked up. "I can go in for Jasper. He's had a cough for 2 days. It's minor, but it's real. I can go in as his mother or as close to his mother as I am." You go and Voss may see you, Owen said. Yes, that's not a small risk. No, she agreed, it isn't. The kitchen was quiet. Garrett looked at Owen. Owen looked at the window. Then Owen looked back at the room and said, Reed goes in from the north side of town. I go around from the west. If Voss shows himself, we're already inside the perimeter. He looked at Clara. You go in, you find what you're looking for, and you come out. You do not wait. You do not decide to look for more. You find the ledger you read, what you need to read, and you walk out. Clara nodded. Do you understand me? Owen said. I understand you. He looked at her for a moment longer, the expression on his face something she had not seen there before, something that had replaced the habitual skepticism with something more complicated, something that looked, if she had been asked to name it, like the face of a person who has decided to be afraid on someone else's behalf. We go the day after tomorrow, Garrett said. Reed needs a day. Reed nodded. They did not speak much more that evening. The fire burned down. Clara put Jasper to bed and sat with him until he slept, which took longer than usual because he could feel the altered quality of the air in the cabin and responded to it the way children respond to things they cannot name, by not settling, by asking for water twice, by holding his wooden horse with both hands instead of one. She sat on the edge of his bed in the dark after he had finally gone under and looked at the shape of him, small and warm and entirely unaware of what his presence in the world had cost and would yet cost. She thought about the papers in his bag. She thought about the initials SAC and what they might mean for the man she had watched move through this town with the unhurried confidence of someone who had not expected to be caught because he had arranged his life so that catching him would require seeing past the person he appeared to be. She had been too trusting. She had looked at Silas Crow on the first day in the post office, and she had thought a kind man, a careful man, a man who chooses to be here instead of somewhere larger and more comfortable because he takes his obligations seriously. She had revised that impression slightly cautiously over the weeks that followed, but not enough, not nearly enough. Outside the window, the cold held its ground. On the other side of the cabin wall, she could hear the low sound of her brothers talking. Not brothers, the Hargrove brothers. They were not her brothers, but they had begun to feel like something adjacent to it, something she did not have a clean word for, something that involved the particular trust that comes from shared difficulty and the knowledge that the people beside you have made their calculations and chosen to stay. All except Garrett, who had not yet decided what he was to her, or what she was to him, or whether those were the same question asked from different sides. She thought about the night at the table, the accounts, the things he had said about Margaret. The way he had said them carefully without the performance of grief, just the flat statement of a man reporting on something real. She had thought, sitting across the table from him in the lamplight, that she understood for the first time what it would feel like to be truly known by another person. Not approved of, not assessed and found useful, but known. Seen in the specific and particular way that one person can see another when they are paying the right kind of attention. She was not ready to do anything with that understanding. She was not sure she would ever be ready. But she had filed it away in the part of herself where she kept the things that changed the shape of what was possible, and she had gone back to the accounts, and they had worked together until 3 in the morning, and nothing had been said that was more than the accounts required, and somehow that had been exactly right. She stood up from the edge of Jasper's bed, crossed the room, paused at the door. He was still holding the horse. Even in sleep, those small hands held on. She went back to the main room. Garrett was banking the fire for the night, moving with the economical efficiency of a man who has performed the same task in the same room 10,000 times and does not need to think about it anymore. He looked up when she came in. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then she said, "The signature. If I'm right about who it belongs to." She stopped. "He came to this ranch twice after I arrived. He looked at the animals. He offered to test the salt himself." "I know," Garrett said. He knew we were getting close to understanding what was happening, and instead of stopping, he doubled down. "I know." She looked at him. "What does that tell you about what he thinks will happen when we find out?" Garrett set down the poker, looked at the banked fire. "It tells me he doesn't think we'll be believed," he said. "He's been here 20 years. We've been suspicious for 2 weeks. Which means the ledger isn't enough. Not on its own. Then we need something else." Yes, she thought. Jasper's papers, with the signature confirmed. combined with the ledger, combined with the Denver report, combined with Voss's presence in the county at the same time. That's a chain, Garrett said. A chain can hold, but only if every link holds. She nodded. He looked at her across the room. The fire behind him, the dark pressing against the windows, the long Montana night settling in around the cabin, and everything inside it. Clara, he said. She waited. Whatever happens in town, whatever Voss does or doesn't do, whatever Crow has prepared. He paused. You are not going to be alone in any of it. She looked at him for a long moment. She had been alone in most things for most of her life. She had learned to be good at it, to organize herself around the assumption of aloneness, the way a house organizes itself around a central beam. The beam was what held everything up. The beam was also what made certain rooms impossible to reach. I know, she said. I'm learning that. He nodded once, went to his room. She heard the door close soft and certain, and then the cabin was quiet except for the fire and the wind and the sound of Jasper breathing in the back room, steady and even and young. She sat down at the table with her unsent letter in her hands and did not open it, just held it, felt the weight of all the things written inside it, and all the things not yet written, and all the things she was beginning to understand she would one day write when she knew how. The night held, the ranch held, and in the town of Millhaven, 9 miles south along a road that the snow was doing its best to obscure, a man with silver hair and a clean coat sat in a warm office above his pharmaceutical shelves and looked at the ledger on his desk and made his own calculations and believed himself beyond the reach of what was coming. He was wrong, but he did not know it yet. None of them did, not entirely. But the morning was coming the way mornings come in Montana, regardless of what the night has been, cold and absolute and full of a light that shows everything exactly as it is. And Clara Whitfield had never once been afraid of what the light revealed. She was not going to start now. They went into Millhaven on a Tuesday. The morning was clear, which was either good fortune or the indifference of weather toward human plans, and the road south from Silver Fork had been packed hard by the cold, so that the horses moved well and without complaint. Clara rode beside Reed, her medical bag across her saddle, her coat buttoned to the collar. Owen had left an hour before them, taking the western track around the ridge so that he would come into town from a different angle. Garrett had stayed at the ranch with Jasper, which had required a brief conversation with the boy that Garrett had handled with the same economy he brought to everything, telling Jasper plainly that he needed help with something in the barn, and that Jasper was the most useful person available. Jasper had received this without suspicion, which said something either about his trust or about Garrett's particular skill with the truth. Clara had watched that exchange from the doorway and had not said anything about it. She thought about it on the road. The way Garrett had looked at the boy, level and direct, with the same quality of attention he gave to anything that required care. The wooden horse was in Jasper's pocket instead of his hands, which meant the boy had graduated to carrying it rather than clutching it. And Clara had noticed this the same way she noticed most things about Jasper, with a quiet tracking that did not require her to name what she was measuring. Progress. That was what she was measuring. Progress was what this whole winter had been about. Millhaven in late November was a town doing its honest work. Smoke from 4 chimneys, a horse at the rail outside the general store. Al Purdy's livery at the north end of the main street opened since before dawn. Martha Hensley's husband Frank sweeping his front step in the cold with the rhythmic unhurry of a man who does the same thing every morning and has made his peace with that. Clara tied her horse at the rail 3 doors down from Crow's office and went in alone. The bell above the door was small and bright. The examination room smelled of camphor and dried herbs, the particular smell of a place where medicine is taken seriously, and in spite of everything Clara knew or suspected, she felt the familiar comfort of that smell and understood that it had been doing its work on people in this room for 20 years, and that the smell itself was not wrong. Only the man who had arranged it. Crow came from the back room when he heard the bell. He was, as he always was, neat, composed, the silver hair in its careful order, the kicking veil behind his eyes polished by long practice into something that looked like warmth. Miss Whitfield, what a pleasant surprise. He looked at her bag. Something I can help you with. Jasper has had a cough for 2 days. Minor, but I wanted to be certain about the preparation. I have some ideas of my own, but I wanted your professional opinion. He smiled the smile of a man who enjoys being consulted. Of course, come in. He led her into the examination room and began asking the predictable questions about the cough, its frequency, its quality, whether the boy had fever. She answered clearly and kept her answers just detailed enough to require follow-up questions, because follow-up questions meant Crow's back would be turned toward the pharmaceutical shelves while he considered and reached and made small decisions. The ledger was where it always was. On the shelf behind the examination table, open to the current month, the spine cracked from years of use, the kind of record that lives in plain sight because no one has reason to question it. She waited for the moment when his back was fully turned. It came when he reached for a compound on the third shelf, rising onto his toes slightly to retrieve it. She crossed the 4 steps to the ledger in the quiet way she moved when she needed to move quietly, and she turned back to October. The pages were organized by date in a clean hand. She found the 15th. Sodium arsenate, 3 pounds. The entry was written with the same untroubled neatness as every other entry on the page. Livestock mineral supplement. Below that, 2 words in a different pen credit account. And beside it, 2 letters RG. She fixed every detail in her memory, turned back to the current month, stepped back to where she had been standing. Crow turned from the shelf with a small glass bottle in his hand. He looked at her with the expression of a man assessing a patient, which was his face for most situations. For a minor cough at his age, I'd suggest this diluted in warm water twice daily. The active component is mild enough that there's no risk of overstimulation. He extended the bottle. She took it, looked at it, then she looked at him. He was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not the warmth, not the professional composure. Something that was checking her carefully the way a man checks a calculation he is not sure has come out right. His eyes moved from her face to the shelf behind the examination table and back again. The silence lasted perhaps 2 seconds. "Thank you," she said. She moved toward the door. "What do I owe you?" "Consider it a welcome to the community," he said. The warmth had returned, but it had returned a fraction of a second too late. She pushed through the door into the cold. She walked at a pace that was not rushing toward the general store. She did not look behind her. She moved through the cold air of Millhaven's main street with the focused calm of someone who understands that the space between a problem and its resolution is not a place to speed through, but a place to navigate carefully, because rushing in that particular space is how people get hurt. She was 10 steps from the general store when Harlan Voss stepped out of the gap between the feed barn and the tanner's shop. He did not say anything. He simply stepped out and stood in her path, and the quality of his stillness was the thing she remembered most about him, the absolute absence of wasted movement. He was not a man who performed threat. He was a man who was threat plainly and without decoration. "The bag," he said. His voice was flat as February. She stopped, looked at him, made the calculation that she had been making since the first night she had seen his camp light at the tree line. "I don't have the papers with me," she said. "Then you'll take me to them." "They're at the ranch." "Then we'll go to the ranch." He was close enough now that she could see the small scar on his jaw and the particular quality of his eyes, which were the eyes of a man who has removed himself from the category of experience that includes consequence. Behind him, the gap between the buildings was empty. Ahead of her, the main street of Millhaven went about its morning business in the total indifference of a Tuesday. She thought about Jasper at the ranch, thought about Garrett with the wooden horse in his large hand, thought about what it would mean for Voss to arrive at Silver Fork with her as leverage. She thought about the distance between where she was standing and the general store. And then she did something that surprised even herself. She raised her voice. Not a scream, a clear carrying call, the kind of voice she had learned to use in rooms where someone was not breathing well and she needed people to move efficiently. "Reed Hargrove, Reed." Voss moved. He closed the distance between them in 2 steps and had her arm above the elbow, the grip designed to be authoritative and invisible from 20 feet away. "Quiet," he said. "Let go of my arm," she said. He did not. The general store door opened. Reed came through it with the particular look of a man who has been waiting for his name and already understands that the situation is not good. Behind him, Martha Hensley appeared in the doorframe, with Frank Hensley's substantial presence filling the space behind her. From the western end of the street, Owen came around the corner at a walk that contained the barely suppressed urgency of a man who has heard something and has made the decision to move. Voss assessed the geometry. He was a professional, and this was what professionals did. They looked at the arrangement of people and distances and made calculations, and the calculation here was not favorable. 3 people were between him and any direction that was not blocked. The woman was not going quietly, and the large man coming around the corner from the west had the expression of someone who had already decided what was going to happen next and was simply arriving to confirm it. Voss released her arm. He stepped back. His expression did not change. "But their time," he said. Owen reached them 15 seconds later. He looked at Clara's arm where the grip had been, looked at Voss. The look on Owen's face was not anger exactly. It was something colder and more deliberate, the expression of someone who has filed a specific grievance in a specific location and intends to return to it. "Walt Greer is the sheriff here," Reed said to Voss. "His office is at the end of this street. You can walk there, or we can walk you there." Voss looked at the arrangement of people around him. He looked at Owen. He looked at Clara, who was standing with her arms at her sides and her chin level and her eyes entirely steady. And if she was afraid, and she was, it was not the kind of fear that showed itself in the ways that were useful to men like Voss. He went to the sheriff's office. They walked him there. Walt Greer was a compact man of 50 with a gray mustache and the deep economy of movement that came from decades of managing a frontier town without enough resources or authority to manage it perfectly. He listened to the account of what had happened on his street with the expression of a man who is building an internal file and will not reach a conclusion until the file is complete. He locked Voss in the single holding room and sat down at his desk. "Talk to me," he said. They talked to him. Clara laid out the chain of evidence the way Reed had described it, link by link. The arsenic report from Denver, the ledger entry with the initials RG, the adoption papers with the signature that read, if the initials were right, SAC, the history of Whitmore House and Ezra Mulgrew and the Meridian Labor Company, the camp light at the tree line, the conversation Martha Hensley had overheard at the boarding house. Walt Greer looked at the Denver report, looked at the copy of the ledger entry that Clara had reproduced from memory on a piece of paper, looked at the adoption papers that Reed had ridden back to the ranch to retrieve, while Owen stayed with Clara and Martha Hensley served them both coffee without being asked. "RG," Greer said. He was looking at the ledger entry copy. His voice when he said those 2 letters had changed in a way that Clara noticed but did not understand until he said, "Raymond Greer is my brother." The room was quiet. Greer looked at the paper for a long time. He looked at the window. He looked at the paper again. "He's been in debt to Crow for 2 years," he said. "Medical bills from when his wife was sick. I knew about the debt. I didn't know about anything else." No one said anything. "I'll talk to him this afternoon," Greer said. He folded the paper with a deliberateness that was doing double duty as the management of something large and private. "If what this says is accurate, he'll talk. Raymond has never been able to carry a secret without putting it down somewhere it can be found." Owen looked at Garrett. Garrett looked at the table. Voss talked before Raymond Greer did. He talked that evening when Greer sat down across from him in the holding room with a lamp between them and the specific quality of patience that sheriffs cultivate over years of waiting for people to understand that silence costs more than speech. Voss was not a man given to loyalty. He was a man given to calculation, and the calculation in the holding room was straightforward. Mulgrew was in St. Louis, which was days away. The Hargrove brothers were in this town, which was yards away. He had made a career of knowing which direction represented the better option. He told Greer about Mulgrew, about Meridian Labor Company, about the children and the contracts and the system of physicians in various towns who served as medical witnesses for a fee. He told him about the arrangement with Crow, who had been providing signatures for 4 years in exchange for protection and a percentage of the transaction value. He told him about the arsenic in the salt blocks, which he had been told about, but had not administered that responsibility, belonging to Raymond Greer, who had done it in exchange for the cancellation of his debt on Crow's direction. He told them what he knew about Crow's arrangement with the Great Northern Railroad, the agreement to facilitate land acquisition along the projected Northern Road by applying pressure to struggling ranchers, pressure that could take many forms, including the slow destruction of livestock. He said all of this with the flat informational tone of a man reading from a ledger of his own, and when he was finished, he asked what the arrangement was going to look like going forward, And Walt Greer told him that arrangement was a conversation for the territorial judge, not for tonight. The full accounting would take days to complete, but by nightfall the shape of it was clear enough. What happened next required a different kind of preparation. Clara took the medical bag back to Silver Fork that night and sat at the kitchen table after Jasper was in bed and Garrett was banking the fire, and she opened the bag and took out the old notebook that lived at the bottom of it, the one that had been there since Dr. Howard Whitfield had pressed it into her hands on the last day she had seen him, capable of pressing anything into anyone's hands. It was his case notebook, 30 years of cases written in the careful hand of a man who believed that observation was the beginning of all knowledge. Most of them meant nothing to her, now entries about patients in cities she had never visited, conditions she had treated herself by that point, and had no need to read about. But there was a section near the end written in a hand that was slightly less certain than the rest, the hand of a man whose eyes had begun to go. She had read this section before. She had not known, when she read it, that it was going to matter. She had not known who the names referred to. She had not known what state she was traveling to. She turned to the page she needed. It was dated January 1872. The heading read, Consultation Post-Mortem, Case MH Female, 28 years, Silver Fork Ranch, Montana Territory. She read it again now, knowing what she knew. She read the notations on the progression of the labor. The time the messenger arrived in town requesting Crow. The time of death 7:30 in the evening. The note that Crow had arrived at 9. The note written in a different ink, as if added later, that a witness at the Millhaven livery stable had reported seeing Crow leave town at approximately 7 in the evening. She read the line that Dr. Whitfield had added at the end, the line she had read before without understanding its weight. If departure was at 7 and not at 4, the journey of 2 hours would have arrived after death. If departure was at 4, his reported arrival would have been at 6:90 minutes before death. The difference between these accounts is the difference between unavoidable loss and preventable loss. I cannot substantiate which is true. I have written what I was told and what I was told by others. I have no power to do more. Clara closed the notebook. She sat very still for a moment. Then she looked at the fire. And then, because the fire was not the person she needed to look at, she turned. Garrett was standing near the hearth. He had not moved when she started reading. He had been watching her read, which she understood only now, and his face had the expression of someone who has been in a room where something important is being said and is not yet sure whether it applies to him. She looked at him. I need to show you something, she said. She put the notebook on the table and opened it to the page, and she told him what it said before he read it because she thought he should hear it in a human voice first, not encounter it alone on a page. She watched his face as she spoke. She watched the moment when the sentence about the departure time arrived in him. She watched what it did to his jaw, the faint tightening that in another man might have been the beginning of anger. But in Garrett was something more complicated, the reflex of a man who has been holding a weight for 2 years, based on a specific belief about who was responsible for the weight and who has just been told the belief was not the whole truth. He sat down. He did not speak. He looked at the table. He looked at the notebook. He looked at the table again. She waited. She had learned in the weeks she had been here that Garrett's silences were not voids to be filled. They were work. Real and necessary work that happened in a place she could not see, and the best thing she could do was be present without interruption. After a long time, he said, I thought it was my fault. I know, she said. I was in the barn that afternoon. I came in late. I thought if I had found her sooner, gotten the message to Crow sooner. He stopped. I've been carrying that. I know. He looked at the notebook, at the date, at the particularity of the handwriting. This man, Whitfield, he knew her case. He was consulted afterward by a local midwife who was present that night and didn't believe Crow's account. She wrote to him because she had heard of him and didn't know who else to trust. He wrote back to her and she sent him what she remembered. He recorded it the way he recorded everything. Clara touched the edge of the notebook. He couldn't act on it. He had second-hand accounts in a suspicious timeline. In a place like this, 20 years ago, that's not enough. But it's enough now. With everything else, yes, it's enough now. He sat with that for a while longer. Outside, the cold was doing what Montana cold does in November, pressing against everything looking for the gap. Inside the cabin, the fire kept the pressing back. Margaret, he said at last. Her name, just her name, held in the air between them, the way a name can hold a whole person when it is said by someone who loved them. Clara did not say anything. She thought there was nothing to say that Garrett needed from her right now, and she was right. He looked at the fire for a long time, and then in the particular way that a man who has never been a man for ceremony sometimes finds the words when they are needed, he said, "She would have wanted to know. She was not a person who preferred comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths." He paused. She would have gone straight to town. Despite herself, Clara almost smiled. Then we should do the same. He looked at her then. The amber of his eyes in the firelight. The 2 years of weight in his face, and beneath it something that had shifted. Not healed, not finished, but shifted the way a bone shifts when it is set correctly after a long time of healing wrong, the sharp pain that is also the beginning of something better. "You came here," he said, "to this ranch, in that storm, with no plan and no guarantees, and a child that wasn't yours." He paused. Why? She thought about the honest answer, not the practical answer about running from Voss or needing a safe place for Jasper. The honest one. "Because I needed to believe that there was somewhere that would hold me," she said. "Not because I was useful, just because I was there." He looked at her for a long time. "This place will hold you," he said. It was not a grand statement. It was not ornamented or performed. It was a sentence said by a man who measured words by their accuracy rather than their elegance, and who had just said the most accurate thing he knew. She looked at him. "I'm beginning to understand that," she said. The fire burned on. Neither of them moved for a long while. And then Garrett rose and put on his coat and went out to do the final check of the barn because the cattle needed what they needed, regardless of what had happened that evening. And Clara sat at the table with Whitfield's notebook in the fire and felt something in herself that she did not rush to name because she had waited long enough for it to arrive that she was content to simply let it be there. The community meeting was held on a Thursday. Pastor Edmund Wells sent the word through Millhaven on Wednesday morning, a formal notice of a public gathering to examine matters of civic concern. He worded it with this care of a man who knows that the words used to summon people to difficult truths affect the quality of their arrival. By noon, the word had reached every family within riding distance of the town. The hall was a large room above the feed store, the largest indoor space in Millhaven. That was not a saloon, and it was full by 7 in the evening. People came with the particular alertness of a community that has been told it is about to learn something important about itself, which is always a mixture of dread and the deep human need to know. Wells stood at the front and explained without drama what had been discovered and how it had been discovered. He presented the documents in order: the chemical analysis from Denver, the ledger entry, the adoption papers, Dr. Whitfield's case notation, Walt Greer's account of Voss's confession, and Raymond Greer's signed statement, which had been obtained as Walt had predicted without great difficulty. Silas Crow was present. He sat in the third row in his clean coat, and he listened to the presentation of evidence with the composure of a man who has spent 20 years being the most credible person in any room he entered, and was now conducting a rearguard action on the strength of that credibility. When Wells finished, Crow stood and spoke. His voice was what it had always been measured reasonable, the voice of a man who takes the well-being of his neighbors seriously. He argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that the testimony of a man like Voss was not reliable, that a signature on a document did not establish intent, that the question of Margaret Hargrove's death had been properly examined at the time and closed. The room listened. Then Clara rose. She did not raise her voice. She did not perform conviction. She stood in the center of the room in her plain coat and spoke with the directness of someone who has been trained to describe what she observes rather than what she wishes were true. And she went through the evidence not as a prosecution, but as a medical account, because medicine was the language she knew and the language this situation required. She described the symptom progression of the poisoned cattle and why it was consistent with systemic arsenic exposure and inconsistent with respiratory illness. She described the specific compound found in the salt blocks and why its presence at that concentration could not be accidental. She described what she understood of Crow's arrangement with the Meridian Labor Company based on Voss's account. She described the adoption contract and the initials on it, and she held up the paper and read the title beneath the signature so that the room could hear its spoken aloud medical witness. When she finished, she sat down. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Al Purdy, who ran the livery stable and had been listening from the back of the room with the patient attention of a man who does not speak unless he has something to contribute, stood up. He was 70 years old and had run the Millhaven livery for 30 of them, and his memory was the kind that decades of practical work had made reliable. I was there that night, he said. January of 72. I remember it because the weather was bad and it was late. Dr. Crow came for his horse at close to 7 in the evening. I remember because I'd already closed up and had to come back out. He looked at the front of the room. He left town at 7, not 4, 7. I saw it. The quality of silence in the room changed. Garrett stood. He spoke briefly with the economy of a man who has decided what he needs to say and is not going to say more than that. He described the morning he had gone to the barn and found Margaret. He described the message he had sent in the time he had sent it. He described arriving home 3 hours later to find his wife gone and Crow only recently arrived. He described the 2 years he had spent believing that the gap between those events was his responsibility. He did not look at Crow when he spoke. He looked at the room at the faces of people who had been his neighbors for 5 years and who were now learning something about the man they had trusted to care for them. He sat down. Crow stood one more time. But the room he was standing in was not the room it had been when he arrived, and even his composure, which was very good, could not entirely obscure what he saw in the faces around him. The meeting ended without a verdict because this was not a court and Wells was not a judge. What it produced was a record witnessed by the full community of Millhaven to be sent to the Territorial Authority in Denver, along with the documentary evidence. Crow would remain in Walt Greer's custody until that authority arrived. Raymond Greer, who had administered the poison, had already been confined. The telegrams went out that night. The Territory would send someone within the month. The rest would follow from there. What happened after the meeting was smaller and quieter and more lasting. Martha Hensley found Claire in the cold outside the hall and put her arms around her without ceremony. It was a brief thing, practical and warm, in the way that Martha was practical and warm, the embrace of a woman who has decided that a person needs to be held and is not going to require a formal invitation to provide it. "You're one of ours now," Martha said. "I just want you to know that." Clara stood in that embrace for a moment and did not say anything because the thing she felt was too large for the words she had available, and she was not going to diminish it by reaching for inadequate ones. The weeks that followed were a different kind of work. The arsenic was cleared from every mineral block on Silver Fork land. Clara supervised the dietary restoration of the surviving animals with the same methodical attention she brought to everything, and 3 of the 4 compromised animals recovered. The 4th did not, and she sat with Garrett in the barn on the morning that one was clear. And she did not offer comfort because she had learned that Garrett did not need comfort, he needed company, and those were not the same thing. Reed placed an order for new breeding stock from a ranch to the north. The numbers in the ledger, which Clara had reorganized over the course of several evenings, showed a path through the winter that was narrow but navigable. She showed Garrett the path, and he looked at it for a long time and then said, "All right," which for Garrett was the equivalent of a lengthy expression of optimism. Owen, who had not returned to the subject of the night in the holding room, or the way he had looked at Clara in the street when Voss had released her arm, found her one morning in the barn, checking Maple's winter health, and stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking. "You handled yourself," he said. She looked at him. "You were there in time. You handled yourself before I was there." She considered this. "I've been handling myself for a long time." "I know." He was quiet for a moment. "What I mean is that it was good to see." She looked at him more carefully. Owen Hargrove, who did not say things he did not mean, who had spent 6 weeks being the person most likely to look for reasons not to trust her, was standing in the barn doorway, telling her it was good to see her handle herself. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and went back to his work. But that evening he carried in a second armload of firewood without being asked, and stacked it where Jasper could reach the lower logs because Jasper had recently developed the ambition of contributing to the fire himself, and Owen had apparently decided this was an ambition worth supporting. Clara saw it from the kitchen and did not say anything about it. She filed it away in the place where she kept the things that mattered. In February, on a Sunday after the service at Pastor Wells' small church, they gathered for Jasper's naming. It was not an official ceremony. The official proceedings were still making their way through the territorial paperwork at a pace that suggested the territory did not share their sense of urgency. But Wells had offered to hold what he called a community acknowledgement, a moment of witness before the people of Millhaven, and they had accepted because it seemed important to do the thing in the daylight where people could see it. The church was full. Not because the event demanded the full community, but because Millhaven was small enough that anything involving three of its working ranchers and the woman who had brought down the town doctor with a medical bag and a case notebook was going to draw attendance. Jasper stood between Clara and Garrett in his cleanest shirt with the wooden horse in his pocket. He had agreed to leave it in his pocket rather than hold it for the occasion, which represented a significant personal concession, and which he had made with the serious face of someone who understands that occasions sometimes require adjustments to personal habits. Wells spoke a few words about belonging and responsibility and the particular kind of family that does not require blood to be real. He looked at Jasper when he said the last part, and Jasper looked back at him with the steady gray gaze that had always understood more than it let on. Then Wells asked Jasper if he understood what was happening. Jasper thought about it with visible thoroughness. "I'm going to be a Hargrove," he said. "That's right. All three of them." He glanced at Owen. Even Owen. Owen, who was standing to the right of Clara, produced an expression that was not quite a smile but occupied the same territory. "Especially Owen," he said. The church produced a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something warmer, and Jasper looked satisfied in the way that people who ask the right questions are satisfied when the answers confirm what they already suspected. He was Jasper Cord Hargrove after that. The paperwork would catch up eventually. Martha Hensley brought food to the cabin that afternoon, which she had announced she was going to do, and which no one had felt confident enough to argue with. There was enough for twice the people present, which was Martha's standard, and the afternoon passed in the particular warmth of a household that is beginning to understand its own shape. Reed at one point appeared in the kitchen doorway where Clara was helping Martha wrap the leftover food. He stood there for a moment, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and without any of the words that had passed between them, that first evening being repeated, they both understood that the conversation was still going, that it had not been finished, only paused, and that the pausing was all right. "Abigail got married last spring," he said. "I got a letter from my cousin in Maryland. She married a school teacher. She looked happy in the description." Clara looked at him. How did that land? He thought about it honestly. Like news about something that used to be mine and isn't anymore, which is different from how it would have landed a year ago. He paused. Different in a better direction. She smiled at him, the real one, not the useful one she deployed when someone needed to be reassured. He smiled back. The easy, unguarded one that was his default when he was not managing anything. Then Jasper came into the kitchen, demanding to know where the dried apples were, and the moment ended, which was fine because it had been complete. Spring arrived in April with the particular authority of seasons that have been postponed too long. The snow retreated up the mountain faces, pulling back from the lower slopes in uneven sheets that left the meadowgrass behind it in pale tentative green. The creek that ran along the eastern boundary of Silver Fork land ran fast and cold, with the melt and the sound of it changed the ambient character of the ranch from the pressed silence of winter to something opener, something with movement in it. The cattle that had survived moved into the new grass with the intention of animals who have been waiting for exactly this. Garrett watched them from the fence line one morning and made a count that was smaller than the count he had made the previous April, but not as small as the count he had made in January, and that difference represented the work of the winter in a single number. Clara found him there. She came out across the wet ground with 2 cups of coffee, which had become a morning practice between them, and handed him one, and stood beside him at the fence. They drank their coffee and watched the cattle and did not speak for a while, which was also a practice. Then Garrett said, "I've been thinking." She waited. "About what you said in the fall, about needing somewhere to hold you." He paused, and she knew from the quality of the pause that he was choosing words the way he chose everything for accuracy over ease. "I was not a man who let much in after Margaret. I thought I was protecting myself. I think now I was just protecting myself from the wrong things." She looked at the cattle in the wet grass. "This ranch is yours," he said, "if you want it, not as an arrangement, not as a practical matter, as a choice." He paused. "I am asking you to stay as a choice. To stay because you want to, not because it makes sense." She looked at him. The strong line of his profile against the April sky the weathered quality of his skin, the amber of his eyes that she had been looking at for 5 months now, and still found that the looking told her something new each time. "I'm already staying," she said. "I know you're staying. I'm asking you to stay on purpose." She was quiet for a moment, a long moment, the kind she took when she wanted to give an honest answer rather than a fast one. "I have been staying on purpose," she said, "for quite some time. I was waiting for you to notice." He looked at her then, and something in his face that had been held carefully in position since the night he had told her what Margaret would have thought of her shifted again, the same bone-setting shift, the same sharp clarity of something being put right. "Then we understand each other," he said. "Yes," she said. "I believe we do." Neither of them moved for a moment. The cattle moved in the green distance. The creek spoke its spring language. Above them, the sky over the Hargrove land was the particular blue of April in Montana, a blue that had no concessions in it, a blue that simply was what it was, without apology or performance. He reached out and took her hand where it rested on the fence post. Not a gesture of grand romantic declaration. The gesture of a man who has decided something and is expressing it in the language he knows, which is action rather than speech. Her hand, small in his large one, did not pull back. She turned it and held his, and they stood at the fence of Silver Fork Ranch in the April morning and watched their cattle move through their land and said nothing else for a long time because nothing else was required. From the barn, Jasper's voice carried across the yard. "Uncle Owen, the new one's trying to stand up." Owen's voice from somewhere inside. "I can see that. Don't touch her." "I'm not touching her. I'm just close to her." "That is touching. Move back." "This is not touching." A brief silence. "Fine, this is barely touching." Garrett looked over his shoulder at the barn. The sound of a new animal in the world, unsteady and insistent and very much alive, came across the spring morning. He looked back at Clara. Something crossed his face that was not quite a smile but held the same warmth. "Come on," he said. They let go of the fence and walked toward the barn together. Inside in the straw, a foal stood on legs that had not yet committed to their own existence, trembling slightly, ears moving like uncertain flags. Owen stood 2 steps back with his arms crossed, watching. Jasper was pressed up against Owen's side, which was technically within the arm-width distance Owen had defined as not touching, but close enough to represent the boundaries of the negotiation. Reed appeared in the barn doorway behind them. He looked at the foal. He looked at the gathered family. He said nothing, which was unusual for Reed, but there are moments that require the particular kind of quiet that someone who loves words knows to offer instead. "She needs a name," Jasper said. He looked at the foal with the serious face of someone who understands that names matter. Garrett looked at the foal for a moment, looked at the barn around him, which had seen some of the hardest winter he had lived through, and was still standing, the same boards and rafters still holding. He looked at Clara. He said, "Hope." Jasper considered it with the thoroughness it deserved, looked at the foal, looked at Garrett. "Hope," he repeated, and then, because he was 6 and because some truths are simple enough for 6-year-olds to say plainly, "That's a good name for something that just got here." Owen looked at the ceiling. Reed looked at the straw. Clara looked at the foal and felt something move through her that she had no word for, but recognized as the feeling of a person who has arrived at last in the place they were always traveling toward. Outside, the April sky held its blue above Silver Fork Ranch. The cattle moved in the new grass. The creek ran east toward the river. The mountains stood as they had always stood, old and patient and indifferent to the small dramas of human lives, and yet somehow present in the way that large and permanent things are present, as context, as measure, as the thing against which everything else knows its size. Inside the barn, a foal named Hope stood on uncertain legs and did not fall. And around her, the people who had brought each other through the winter stood together in the ordinary light of a morning that was only remarkable because they were in it, which is the only kind of remarkable that lasts.